So, is a recession imminent? The president dismissed the idea before heading to the G7 summit by saying, quote, "We are very far from a recession." I'm sure you're very comforted. But economists across the globe have started ringing the warning bells based on the trade war, contractions in the manufacturing sector, and declining corporate profits.
Our next guest was in the midst of the 2008 recession during the Obama administration as former Chief Economist to Vice President Joe Biden. Jared Bernstein currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and he recently wrote in an op-ed for the Washington Post some of the lessons that he took away from handling the crisis and how the administration could prepare for a downturn. He joins us now to explain. Welcome, sir. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Jared.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Jared, you're looking at this. Is it very much, are there rumblings of 2007? What are the underlying conditions within the economy that could lead us to a recession?
Well, actually, there aren't really rumblings like there were back then when balance sheets of households and corporations and financial markets were really out of whack. The housing bubble was poised to burst back then, and that really undermined the credit system. In fact, while there's a lot of debt out there, interest rates are very low, so servicing that debt isn't that heavy a lift. So the household corporate balance sheets look pretty good. The consumer is actually quite strong, and we still have a low unemployment rate. The threat here is coming from the White House. The trade war, you read any article that's getting nervous about recession, and it will cite the trade war in the first paragraph. And I think that's because it's leading to a level of both interrupting supply chains, that hurts economies, and uncertainty around investment.
I mean, the housing crash and collapse looked, in retrospect, like it was obvious, but most people got it wrong building up to it, right? And one of the few people who did get it right was Elizabeth Warren. She's now sounding the alarm bells again. Part of what she's talking about is personal debt, so credit card debt, car loan debt in particular, student loan debt. So rather than there being sort of one source, as there was in the housing crisis, people are taking on debt in a variety of areas. She also points to this manufacturing recession. Is there anything to what she's saying there? Yeah,
and the latter part, the manufacturing recession, that's real. So our manufacturing sector has actually been contracting for 6-7 months now. And in your grandfather or great-grandfather's economy, that would have been pretty obviously recessionary. But for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but the manufacturing sector is just a much smaller part of the economy. It used to be at its peak maybe 30% of employment. Now it's less than 10% of employment. And I just think we're pretty unlikely to get a recession from that sector. However, we get very obsessed about this idea of recession, which is, GDP crossing zero,
right?
Going negative. But if the economy slows down enough to put enough pressure on people, many of whom are only now catching a buzz from a recovery that's in its 11th year, that's going to hurt too. So we should be mindful of a slow growth recovery is also a problem.
Well, I think, Jared, the real question here is about, with the trade war, is it possible to rebalance the trading relationship with China and not feel some consumer impact? Because it has been 40 years at this point of policy has oriented our society and our consumerism to a point where we're so dependent on that. Is it possible in any way to rebalance without feeling the impact?
I think there has to be some impact. I think the answer to your question is broadly no, but it's a matter of the depth of that impact. So if we were to, for example, get tougher on some of the things, and by the way, China isn't doing this right now, but some of the countries that manage their currency to keep their exports to us very cheap, so that exacerbates our deficit, but it also means that you go to the shelves in Walmart and things are really cheap. Some of those prices would go up. But as an economist, I've long understood the relationship between prices and wages, and so you can't have low prices every day everywhere and then expect to have high wages. So if you view the kinds of interventions that are behind your question, trying to rebalance a trade deficit that's been, a negative economic issue for, 30 years now, with a more broader perspective and a way of helping to create more quality jobs, then consumers, based on earning higher wages, could afford slightly higher prices.
Yeah. Well, and kind of to that point, you talked about how a lot of people are just now starting to see any kind of benefit from a recovery that's in its 11th year. Are we using the right metrics to measure the health of our economy? Because even now, with unemployment so low, with the stock market's been kind of all over the place, but in general it's been high. many people can't even afford, a $400 emergency. I mean, they are living right on the edge, and they are not really seeing the benefits of a growing economy. So what are the right metrics to use to really assess how people are actually doing?
Well, first of all, let me agree with you that we're not using the right metrics. Now, I think it's legitimate to say a recession, rule of thumb, that's a couple of quarters of GDP contracting. I mean, that's kind of an old rule of thumb, and I think it makes some sense. But it doesn't give you much insight into the nuances that you're talking about. And in our era of such highly elevated inequality, I shouldn't even call those nuances, because they're really the big
obvious,
story.
yeah.
They're such a core story for how so many people experience the economy. So yeah, I do think you should look at basically the thing that I sort of like to look at most gets to what you were just kind of getting at, Crystal, which is how are families getting by? The extent to which their income is commensurate with the budgetary kind of pressures they face. So people have to pay for childcare, they have to pay for health care, they have to pay for housing. It's interesting, if you talk about China trade, as we were just talking about a second ago, a lot of that is about cheap consumer goods, and in fact those prices have been low for a long time. But if you look at childcare, if you look at healthcare, if you look at education, those prices have by far beat the average pace of inflation, and they've gone way ahead of many people's incomes, and that's why you get the result you were just talking about. There is a lot more economic insecurity when it comes to people making their family budgets than you'd know from looking at top-line numbers.
Well, Crystal and I talk about this all the time. GDP growth is not the end-all be-all of society, and just because you have cheaper consumer goods doesn't mean that you're better off holistically as an American family. So what are the things?
Often the opposite.
And actually, yeah, frankly, the opposite. But if we look at these things from a structural perspective, and I think this is really what the White House is trying to get at, if even with the sledgehammer, which is how can policy be crafted in a way to support the American family without feeling some sort of contraction for overall financial institutions?
Well, that's actually pretty easy, and I'll get to that in a second. First of all, let me just sort of underscore your point when you sort of said sotto voce, it's actually the opposite.
Right.
So I agree with that. So GDP does not reflect the damage that we've done to our environment, and in fact, it is the opposite. If you have, if climate change induces horrible weather and hurricanes, and it blows, ruins a town or something, building that back up is a plus for GDP, not a negative. So you're right about that. See, the point that this idea that it's be some sort of heavy architectural policy lift to push back on the kinds of dynamics we're all concerned about here, I think is belied by this notion that we are an incredibly wealthy country. It's just that the wealth is so concentrated. If you have a country where over 30% is held by the top 1% and 1% of the wealth is held by the bottom 50%, clearly, if you were able to redistribute some of that wealth and income and power from the top of the scale to the middle and the bottom, you would resolve, or at least begin to resolve, some of the problems that actually have been talking about all day today, including poverty. So that's not a growth discussion, that's a distribution discussion. Now, some economists will tell you, well, if you start fooling around with the distribution, you're going to hurt the growth, but there's a lot of research that shows that to be really a largely false claim.
So while we have you, I got to ask you about your old boss. I won't ask you a political question, but I want to ask you an economic question. Do you think that Joe Biden has the right plans in place to deal with some of these trends and the structural change, including changing trade, including the threat of automation? Does he have a grasp of the crisis and the sort of large-scale plans to be able to deal with it?
It's a fair question, but once you work for somebody closely, especially in that situation in the White House, in the midst of the deepest recession, since you kind of develop a sense of loyalty. So I have that.
Yeah,
and,
sure, fair.
I like a lot of what I'm hearing, and I think, in fact, there isn't as much difference as you might think when you start digging down into some of these plans on trade and taxes. Let's talk about taxes for a second. Biden doesn't go as far as, say, Elizabeth Warren, and I really like a lot of her plans too on this. So he's not proposing a new way of going after wealth the way she is, but he is proposing significantly higher taxes on wealth, which would be expanding some of the policies that are already in place. On trade, I haven't heard him elaborate as much of a trade plan as say, Senator Warren has, but she's ahead of everybody on that front. So we'll have to wait and see more on that.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jared. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Coming up, new polling has 2020 candidate Andrew Yang in 5th place above Pete Buttigieg even. Plus, Senator Sanders shares with me one thing he thinks China does well.
Kamala Harris's Medicare for All flip-flop somehow is getting worse, and Senate Democrats are afraid of the unknown when it comes to replacing Senator Susan Collins. Team Rising will weigh in on all of this next.